Ugh, re-releases. Don't you just hate them? So lazy. Anyway, here's all of our PS1 hidden gems we've recommended to you beautiful people over the years compiled into one video, but we've at least given you some new ones first as well. It's like a director's cut with a bit of DLC, all for free. Right, let's crack on. We're burning daylight here, people. Okay, this game is so adjacent, right, to Daytona USA that we could play the song and get away with it, but we probably shouldn't. Alright, just quickly, just a little bit. Lovely, lovely stuff. Burning Road is the kind of alternative Aldi version of a popular video game you don't see too much of these days, unless there are Souls-like apparently. Very much Ridge Racer and Daytona USA, but at home, Burning Road is not quite as good as its obvious inspirations, but it's still a pretty fun arcade racer for an afternoon. Developed by Toka, later of Hidden Invasion fame, remember that, PS2? Burning Road looks pretty good for an early-ish 3D PS1 game with solid-ish draw distance and an all-important frame rate that isn't about to self-destruct at any moment. There is a lot going on with you bouncing off opposition cars and walls every other minute and lots of weather effects happening too, but the performance is pretty up to the task. Unfortunately, there's not really too much to do in Burning Road and you might have your fill of it in about 2 hours. Also, the soundtrack sounded like it was made by a composer who had simply been given the words burning and road and had a morning to put noises together. All in all though, this is a fun, fat-free arcade racer worth returning to. The OG PlayStation had a lot of really brilliant multiplayer military combat games. Who can forget the random Scouse accent in Worms or the Rick Mail in Hogs of War? But a lot of people seem to have forgotten Return of Fire over the years. A top-down vehicular shooter where you have to capture the enemy flag and blow all sorts of stuff up. Return Fire lets you pick from 4 different types of vehicles and then lets you loose on a map. Use vehicles like the tank to weaken enemy defences and then yoink the flag with a jeep and zoom on out of there. It's pretty simple, but pretty brilliant stuff. Originally released for the 3DO 2 years prior, Return Fire has a pretty simple premise, and really the tactics don't evolve too much beyond point and shoot, but fans of Soviet Strike will probably get a kick out of this one, particularly in multiplayer. I'd even say its slightly more cartoonish art style makes it a better game visually compared to Soviet Strike and the rest of the series really. While the game's difficulty does get absolutely absurd the deeper into you go, with you getting ganked quicker than you would stepping out of London Euston train station with your wallet in your hand, Return Fire is all things considered a solid bit of fun. But again, beware of it ruining your mental health if you want to tackle its campaign. The PS1 truly had an embarrassment of riches when it came to RPGs. Sneeze when picking up a DualShock and there's a good chance you would suddenly find yourself playing in an eco-conscious role-playing game with a party filled full of very attractive polygons. It does mean that games like Hoshigami ruining Blue Earth get a bit overlooked though. You probably know exactly which other PS1 game I'm gonna compare this one to. That's right, Glover. No, Final Fantasy Tactics. Max 5 very obviously copied Square's Lunch a bit with this one, but the unique wrap system is quite clever. You have a bar and you can only do actions as long as that bar isn't full, and so stuff like moving takes up less and how far do you want to go and so on and so on. It's pretty clever. It's a pretty cool system that requires you to think way ahead and plan everything. There's also permadeath here, which is pretty unique-ish for the time, but does mean that you can very easily lose a lot of progress as the enemies seem to auto-level with you, so every fight is pretty close and there's no option to revive until way later in the game. There are a lot of small irritations with Hoshigami, like having to select certain things about 15 times, and the weird way it doles out XP as well. However, if you're looking for a bit of a unique spin on FFT, Hoshigami has a nice cast of characters to recruit, lovely visuals, and loads of spells and abilities to unlock as you build up your mercenary crew. Just beware this hidden gem has a few flaws to buff out before you prepare to pay some, you know what, not unholy prices for a rare PS1 RPG. That's a nice surprise. A game like the Unholy War simply wouldn't get made these days. Yeah, a weird arse mashup of genres featuring two squabbling factions fighting for land? With a name like that? Yeah, probably not. The Unholy War is split into two modes. Mayhem is basically Power Stone before Power Stone, with you fighting in an arena with free movement using energy to power specific attacks in a system that honestly, genuinely reminds me of The Simpsons wrestling? I'd bet that someone at Big Ape Productions was a pretty big fan of the Unholy War actually, and copied a lot of Toys for Bob's unique strategy brawler. Yep. This was made by that Toys for Bob, the Spyro Reignited and Crash 4 guys. So how does the game actually play? Well, the combat is all hilariously unbalanced in a fun way for the most part. Some characters are just slugs with legs, while others fly around the battlefield throwing fireballs. Yeah, Tekken it ain't, but it's still pretty fun. You can also take part in strategy mode, a more extremely light Civ-like mode where you move around hexagons on a map and try to capture the enemy base. Different characters can affect the map with their specific abilities, and you can use a resource called Hour to buy more units by mining specific tiles. Encounter opposition on one of those tiles and you will go into one of those nonsensical battles. The Unholy War is a baffling bit of sci-fi goodness that shoots for the stars and doesn't completely reach them, but it's still a good, slightly broken time. Now, here's a PS1 game that sounds like a forgotten nu metal band.
They're everywhere! Call in more support!
As well as supporting Limp Bizkit on their 1998 tour, Uprising X is more proof that the PlayStation could do first person pretty well. Originally released for the 3DO, and no, I'm not getting commission for being the third person to ever shout out the 3DO on YouTube, Uprising X is primarily a shooter where you fight for rebels from the cockpit of a tank. You'll be chipping away at enemy forces with an array of weapons across large sandbox-ish environments, using both sticks on the DualShock to move the tank and the camera. It was a pretty novel system for the time, and is a tad clunky now compared to more modern systems, but an absolute precursor to the FPS controls that are pretty standard now. Where Uprising X gets pretty interesting is in your ability to call down a citadel, which is a giant tower which basically gives you a view of the whole battlefield. From here you can call in more infantry and air support as well as additional tanks. It gives the game a nice strategy light appeal, emphasis on light though. It's nowhere near as deep as some RTS games or even FPS games really, but Uprising X changes things up often so that you never get bored, and even then you can try out the game's pretty fun multiplayer too. If you like tanks and a soundtrack that sounds vaguely like an old wrestling game, this is well worth a shout, especially at prices like these for physical collectors. It's wild to sift through the PS1 library and realise just how many games more catered for a PC crowd actually managed to launch on Sony's grey rectangle of wonders. Warcraft 2 and the Theme trilogy are just a couple that stand out, but Sentient didn't seem to stand out for anyone. Developed by Psygnosis in their 12th published game of 1997, what were they feeding their employees back then? Sentient is a wildly ambitious first-person adventure game that never really gets its due, that sees you playing as Garrett Sharover after he's sent to a space station to investigate radiation sickness aboard. What's brilliant about Sentient, and so far ahead of its time, is how open-ended it is. You can fail your very first task, and the game will just go about its business towards one of its multiple different endings. You can also really influence those endings by simply talking to people, with the conversations themselves being far more complex than about 99% of other PS1 games, or just games in general. Being able to select every other word in a sentence is wild stuff. However, Sentient is more than just a bit slow, with a story that could have been tightened up a tad, and the facial models do kinda look like you tried to 3D print your nan a new kneecap. That said, it's nuts to see just how many wild swings were taken with this some 27 years ago, and it'd be good to see a modern dev trying something similar. But maybe it's just not fated to get its due. Threads of Fate is one of those hidden gems where it feels like every JRPG fan who's even sniffed a DualShock says it's underrated to the point where it's pretty well renowned within those circles. However, we're nothing if not a democratic bunch of birds here, and if you guys keep wanting us to give Threads of Fate some shine, we're gonna manifest just that, people. Developed by Square, Threads of Fate is another action RPG from the company released at the turn of the millennium like Vagrant Story that kinda got a bit caught up in the swarm of RPGs released in the wake of Final Fantasy VII's massive success, with it coming out just a couple of weeks after Final Fantasy IX. Didn't really have much of a hope, to be fair. In it you play as Rue or Mint as they search for a hidden relic that will grant them a wish, with each story going in different directions. Went a bit Sean Connery at the end there, didn't I? You will be platforming, puzzle solving, enjoying some pretty approachable combat, transforming into monsters as Rue, and listening to Mint do a whole bunch of swearing across Threads of Fate's decently sized story. Threads of Fate has a few serious moments, but overall has a breezy, relaxed tone, and so is a pretty good palate cleanser between much bigger, more traditional RPGs, but multiple playthroughs are recommended if you want to connect Rue and Mint's story together. If you got a kick out of something like Brave Fencer Musashi, you'll probably get a kick out of Threads of Fate too. And as far as PS1 exclusive RPGs go, it's not the most expensive game ever to grab physically speaking, but matey, you know where to turn to play this one. It's pretty common to see anime get turned into a video game. Shh, listen quietly, and you can probably hear another Naruto Ninja Storm game getting released. But it's much rarer to see a video game get turned into an anime, especially if they're both one and dones. Originally released for the PS1 in Japan in 2000 and then turned into an anime in 2001, Cosmo Warrior Zero is an almost completely forgotten franchise that focuses on an ex-military man with a tragic past who must hunt down a space pirate called Captain Harlock. In terms of how that translates to a video game, Cosmo Warrior Zero is a pretty dang eye-catching arena battler of sorts with tons of environmental interactivity, great sound design, and surprisingly fluid animation and controls as you hunt down rebels. Interestingly, the game also has a downtime moment where it becomes fixed perspective with tank controls as you trek to the legendary Leiji Matsumoto, creator of Cosmo Warrior Zero, and also the massively influential space battleship Yamato, as well as a whole bunch of other things within this space opera, space. With some awesomely styled cutscenes, multiple modes and characters, and pretty tense chaotic gunplay, Cosmo Warrior Zero is a genuine gem. What's going on in it? Don't ask me that, please. Thanks. If I said, right, PS1 3D Super Metroid to you, how quickly do you think you could download an ISO? Not related to that super depressing movie, the Divide Enemies Within is instead the most deliberate Metroid clone you could ever get. I mean, its creator even said that's what they were going for. Developed by Radical Entertainment, who would go on to make the more than cromulent The Simpsons Hit and Run, The Divide is a very narratively ambitious PS1 game dealing in stuff like existentialism and technological advancement. You play as Tankin after an expedition to a frozen planet goes terribly awry and he wakes up years after his partner is taken. The Divide has a really eerie, thick atmosphere as you explore the ruins in your mech and gradually become able to discover more of the map with the more items you acquire and the more exotic the biomes become. There's a very neat power curve that comes with unlocking more and more items for your suit, just like in Metroid. The Divide also looks pretty good with solid animations and great creature designs, but the audio is really crunched within an inch of its life sometimes, and the native frame rate can be some of the worst on the console at points. So yeah, it's certainly a flawed game, but The Divide is extremely ambitious for a 3D game released in 1996, the year of the cat, and it just has this really alien, really disquieting vibe that hits well. It's a blast if you can get on its wavelength. Just when you thought it was safe to go back outside, here comes the Master of Blasting. Blasting again. The fifth game in the Blaster Master series that stretches back to the NES, Blaster Master Blasting Again was Sunsoft's attempt to bring the game into the 3D world, and, well, it didn't really work out for them, as following Blasting Again, the series was dead until a reboot in 2010. But Blasting Again itself is not entirely to blame for that though, I think. I mean, it did take until November 2001 for it to reach the United States, when the PS2 was already long out. This came out a week after Metal Gear Solid 2 in America. I mean, really. Blasting Again follows Roddy and Elfie, the children of the hero from the earlier games, as they look to stop their father's old nemesis by digging deep underground and laying waste to his Tetsuyo abominations, with Roddy piloting a pretty fun to control tank and blasting away. Again. The big ace up Blasting Again sleeve is the exploration, with each of the game's levels being super open for discovery as you zoom across them. However, there are also some moments where you have to get out of your tank to go on foot, is that a Titanfall reference? And acquire new items. Sometimes you even need to backtrack to way earlier areas with those items to unlock new routes. And I'm not saying this is a Metroidvania, right? But I'm not saying it isn't like one either. Blasting Again, to be fair, has some very clunky on-foot controls, constant loading screens and kinda dull environments, but the actual blasting while you listen to music that honestly could have come from Sonic R, respect Sonic R, remains pretty fun throughout. You couldn't convince most younger players of this these days, but Myst really is one of the most important influential game series ever. While Myst itself did come to PS1, it's basically a slideshow with constant loading screens, so let's talk about Juggernaut instead. Developed by Tonkin House, who also made Super Tennis on the SNES. Okay, Juggernaut is a feverish old school adventure game with horror elements that hops between about a million different settings and ideas. One minute you'll be in a mansion, the next you're in the future finding people who are accused of diet fraud. Oh, and also you're exploring the soul of your girlfriend after she's been possessed by demons. Probably should have led with that. Juggernaut is pretty light on gameplay, with you venturing between different hubs and solving puzzles by collecting items and clicking everything that can be clicked. However, it also has some really cool environments for people who make liminal spaces their personality. What's a liminal space? It's just an office. Relax, and it's just so off-kilter that it's worth checking out. If you enjoyed LSD but wish there was an off-putting priest popping up every other minute and telling you how to live your life, Juggernaut is certainly an experience. It's always fun to find an old game where the critical reception just completely clashes with what the players thought. Critics did not jive with Dragon Valor at all, but it must be noted here that the worst review for the game came from a publication that seems to have been completely shamed out of existence. Why would you make yourself completely unsearchable in public? Bank. Dragon Valor is an action RPG helmed by Now Productions, who later helped to make Katamari Damacy, and is the third game in the previously Japan-only Dragon Buster universe. You will never guess what you have to do to dragons in this one, guys. A pretty meaty action RPG with chunky heavy combat, Dragon Valor feels a bit like a more expansive 3D Golden Axe, but with you able to cast spells too. The combat is overall pretty solid, and hitting stuff with a big bastard sword is always good, but the choice-driven role-playing here is a bit nuts, with single choices spinning off into big new directions. Your character Clovis can marry different women, with you then playing as one of his children, which then leads to multiple endings. Yeah, this one has a ton of replayability. Dragon Valor is a wee bit rough around the edges, and no multiplayer feels like a kind of a whiff, but the huge boss fights against dragons, branching paths, and seriously banging soundtrack make this a really decent time if you want to swing a massive sword. There's a lot to be charmed by in Tecmo's Deception Invitation to Darkness. The first is the name. You just don't get developer names in name games anymore. But EA should call their sports games EA's Deception Invitation to Waste All Your Bloody Money. The second is that this is an idea that still feels super novel, and while the Deception series would spawn sequels well up until the PlayStation 4, the core concept of the series is difficult to replicate anywhere else. The first game, also known as Devil's Deception in Europe, sees you playing as the framed heir to a murdered king who's seeking their revenge, and so takes over the Castle of the Damned because it's a nice gift from a nice lady. Don't worry about her, she's just nice. You can even design the castle yourself with a full-on editor, which is a wild touch for a 1996 PS1 3D game. Do you remember the Tenchu map editor? Drop your comment down below. But the main gameplay here revolves around placing down traps to kill or capture assailants. Those traps including some classics and also a giant foot descending from the heavens. Each of your assailants even has a background story you can look up. Not all of them are here for malicious reasons, giving the game unexpected dramatic weight. That shouldn't stop you from turning them into monsters to fight for you though. Not being able to attack enemies takes a bit of getting used to, and sometimes the traps can be a bit finicky due to early 3D game design, but this is a really unique trap 'em up on the PS1, worth checking out. A Japan-only genre defier that's recently had a pretty good English patched version published online. Oops, I slipped and fell. Planet Laika is a trip. Not only because you go to Mars, which is fairly far away, but also because you'll do so as an anthropomorphic dog with a personality disorder. Developed by Z-Canned Quintet of ActRaiser, Soulblazer and Terranigma fame among others, Planet Laika's name is almost certainly a reference to the best girl who ever lived, but I can't talk about her for too long because it makes me too sad. It's plain to see why Planet Laika didn't come west in 1999, people just weren't ready for it. Part reflection on mental health and societal issues, part Pong, part a bunch of people with dog faces walking around on an alien planet. Planet Laika feels like a survival horror game in terms of fixed camera perspective and atmosphere, except swap the guns for an energy ball that can deflect attacks back at enemies. Oh, and combat only happens when Laika's personality is split into one of 3 personalities. Oh, and you do that by absorbing people's aura. Yeah, Planet Laika is a lot to take in at once, and sometimes it says and does weird stuff just to say and do weird stuff rather than have any deeper meaning, but its abstract nature and wild narrative swings mean that you will have something to say about it, no matter what. If you like Fugue Melodies of Steel but wish its misery was more esoteric and also not really like it because the game's not like anything else out there, Planet Laika is a hidden gem you really just have to roll with. Alright, look, this isn't that hidden of a gem on PS1, but the fact is that I've somehow never ever talked about rollcage on this channel. Also, ask 100 people in a room to mention a PS1 racing game and rollcage will probably not be the first game that comes to mind, so in it goes. For those not in the know, rollcage is a racing game developed by attention to detail of Cybermorph fame. Anyone? Bit of Cybermorph? Jaguar? Bit of Jaguar Cybermorph, anyone? And published by our old friends at Psygnosis. One of many PS1 games that shaped childhoods through demos alone, the thing that's always stuck with me as one of those now grown-up children who is slightly taller but not much, is simply how ball-breakingly fast rollcage felt and how fast it could make your head spin. Pretty novel for the time of its release, cars are able to race along walls and ceilings at breakneck speeds, letting you hit boost pads to give you a shortcut or even reach different routes. The physics on show here were very impressive for 1999, and even today, just the way your car reacts to being thrown around everywhere, flipping upside down and bouncing off stuff, can make for some super fun moments. Chuck in that breakneck speed, a banging 90s drum and bass soundtrack and power-ups to ruin your mates with, and you've got a pretty fun and silly Wipeout alternative that's still enjoyable today. Check out the solid spiritual successor Grip from some of the original dev team if you need a bit more shiny. We've been known to celebrate the tactical RPGs around these parts, with both Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics earning a decent amount of play from us, but Big Dave in our comments section had another suggestion in mind. Vandal Hearts was a great little strategy RPG that I never hear about anymore. Well, Big Dave, you've now manifested a bit of Vandal Hearts coverage. Now quickly, manifest a new F-Zero game while you're at it, we need your help. One of many franchises from Konami that's seemingly been abandoned over the years, Vandal Hearts follows the same pattern as a lot of other strategy RPGs of the time, with battle taking place over an isometric grid. Each side takes turns moving units around, with the units boasting one of 7 unique classes. Naturally, there's a rock paper scissors like weakness chart to consider, with melee being strong against archers and mages, archers being deadly against flying units, while airborne units can wreck swordsmen. There's some additional nuance to consider as the 3 magical classes add an extra wrinkle to your strategy, ensuring Vandal Hearts remains a compelling tactics experience from start to finish. The story to Vandal Hearts might be one of its best features though, as you control a knight by the name of Ash Lambert. A member of the Republic of Ishtaria, Ash and a group of his friends stumble upon a government conspiracy by some corrupt officials to turn the Republic into a tyrannical empire. Between the various characters you'll meet along the way and the excellent battle mechanics, there's plenty of enjoyment to be found in Vandal Hearts, and if you've dedicated your heart to the IP, there's both the PS1 sequel Vandal Hearts 2 and PS3 and Xbox 360 prequel Flames of Judgment to sink your teeth into, though sadly the series has long since ghosted. Ghost in the Shell is probably a lot of people's first port of call when it comes to the world of anime not named Pokemon. It's between Ghost in the Shell, One Piece and Dragon Ball, let's be honest. I can't go 5 minutes without jamming an Attack on Titan reference into one of these videos personally, while Ghost in the Shell has become a globally recognised franchise with multiple spin-offs and an incident that occurred in 2017, you might have forgotten about the PS1 game from 1997. Stash Merkin 9576, was that Merkin as in for pubes? Never forgot though, stating the Ghost in the Shell game for PS1 was excellent. Short and to the point there, Stash, but your comment is definitely valid, as the game offers a new look into the cyberpunk world of Ghost in the Shell without simply rehashing the events of the original manga. Do you personally say manga or manga? Let me know down below. The original English voiceover cast from the first movie make a return to voice their characters in the game too, which is a nice touch for fans of the series. Masamune Shiro, the manga's own author, even wrote and illustrated the game's story, so it definitely has the anime equivalent of whatever the Nintendo seal of quality is. Instead of plonking players in the circuitry of Major Motoko Kusanagi, you play as the Rookie, the newest member of Public Security Section 9, investigating a terrorist organisation known as the Human Liberation Front. There's always liberation fronts in anime, isn't there? Instead of boots on the ground action like it's World War II when we're about to flip some trains, Ghost in the Shell boasts robotic legs on the ground, as you control a spider-like tank called the Fuchikoma that's capable of scaling walls and ceilings. You should come to expect this from the guys behind Jumping Flash. While the game has been considered to be a bit on the easy side, the various objectives across the missions and the novel abilities the Fuchikoma is capable of ensure Ghost in the Shell is entertaining as hell. Also, what a beautiful game. If only we'd realised that earlier. For how much we've celebrated the various hits and hidden gems that the PS1 received over the years, one company's impact might not have been represented as well as it should have been: Psygnosis. While their legacy extends back to the 80s, Psygnosis and PS1's legacies were intertwined largely due to one release: Wipeout. However, commenters like MitchBaz93 helped to steer our ship to Psygnosis' other releases like Overboard, which I keep forgetting mixed up with Overblood in my brain because I'm stupid. A game I believe is forgotten is Overboard, says Mitch. Great game, never seen it spoken about. Overboard, also known as Shipwreckers in North America, is exactly what it sounds like, a pirate adventure game. You're in control of a pirate ship looking to raise your Jolly Roger across your enemy's territory, but the only way to do that is by sailing your ship through ports, waters and islands that have been suspiciously laid out like they're meant to trap and ambush you. It's basically Maze Runner in a pirate ship. Maze Sailor, maybe? Either way, you have to dodge traps and defeat enemies across 5 distinct worlds in order to become known as the greatest pirate that ever lived in under 1,000 chapters. If that isn't enough to convince you why Overboard is considered a hidden gem, the game also supports 5-player multiplayer matches via the 4-way multi-tap connector, though managing to get hold of 5 patrols back during the late 90s sounds like a nightmare. Never mind 4 friends on top of that. Why didn't they just go to 6 players though? Did they have to keep on moving or something? With its silly tone and fun gameplay, it's a shame that Overboard didn't gain much attention when it launched, though it's not surprising considering Psygnosis launched 14 other games in 1997 alone, which is almost as many Last of Us ports as we got in the last 2 years. Talk about the grind, eh? When chatting about the skateboarding games of the PS1, the conversation tends to stick between just two games, Thrasher Skate and Destroy and Tony Hawking's Pro Skatings. We don't need to talk about which game is the winner of the two because Axel probably wouldn't have done this but one skateboarding game on the PS1 that's been lost in the shuffle compared to the others is a Grind Session. Thankfully, we had long-time viewer and all-round good egg FarmCat8484 in the comments to spotlight a long-forgotten gem. Everyone was playing the Tony Hawk games, but I enjoyed this one immensely. Like other skateboarding games, Grind Session sees players travelling to different locations, trying to complete goals and earn the most points across the various levels. Grind Session did launch after Tony Hawk with a demo that is the stuff of legend for some people, so the two share plenty of similarities in terms of gameplay. Admittedly, Grind Session is pretty derivative of Tony Hawk in a few ways, with mostly similar controls, along with the fact that Grind Session even included the level Burnside from THPS1. It was a real location of course, so it's not like they were copying, but they definitely knew what they were doing here. If you're wondering how similar the two games were, the developers Shabba Games would go on to be acquired by Activision, eventually working on the Tony Hawk's franchise in a support capacity. They also went on to make Shrek's Super Slam on the PS2, which of course deserved to be celebrated. Naturally, Activision responded to Shabba's talent by shutting the whole studio down in 2009. At least we can remember the excellent games they helped make across their 12-year lifespan.
It's nice.
If you want the byword on underwater exploration, people will likely point to Subnautica, Unknown Worlds' survival franchise that allows you to become intimately familiar with whatever horrors lie beneath the surface of the water. Spoiler alert, there's a lot of horror, but no third-party 360 controllers. However, Subnautica isn't the first underwater exploration game, with Almost Cool Guys in the YouTube comments letting us know about another forgotten whipper. Gotta add Treasures of the Deep to this list. Awesome underwater shooter. You got it, boss. Developed by Black Ops Entertainment of later America's 10 Most Wanted fame, Treasures of the Deep thankfully has got nothing to do with one man proposing to an octopus. You control a deep-sea diver searching beneath the waves, but treasure isn't the main focus of the game. While Treasures of the Deep opens up with players raiding downed Spanish galleons or Aztec treasures in underwater tombs, many of the game's 14 levels sees the player facing off against Seismic Corporation, who have been committing many illicit acts under the sea. You can't exactly get treasures from the deep if there ends up being no deep to get treasures from, after all. Across the game's levels, you'll utilise a slew of different wetsuits before graduating into actual submersible vehicles, fending off hostile humans and the wildlife in the process. You're going to be attacked by a lot of sharks, is what we're saying. For a PS1 game, Treasures of the Deep's depiction of life under the sea deserves to be preserved in the Hall of Fame, as the atmosphere, tone, and often claustrophobic nature of being underwater is on full display here. Also, there's an unlockable bonus level where you control a shark to get revenge on the various sea life and divers unfortunate enough to be in your way. I just remembered Street Sharks. Anyway, next entry. Gregatron Gaming's comment of Power Shovel is my favourite PSX game that I don't see listed a lot might have missed the eyes of most who have scrolled through our comments section. It's unassuming and doesn't really give you an idea of what the game might be about, but that absolutely does not describe the game itself. Anyone curious enough to wonder what the hell Power Shovel's deal is will find one of the most bonkers games on the entire console. Developed by Taito, Power Shovel is an arcade-style collection of minigames, with the rub being that you're in control of a series of construction vehicles, but instead of building a house or repairing the patio of some annoying Karen, you're navigating mazes that appear to be floating in the void. That's just the tip of the iceberg of Power Shovel's weirdness, which also includes minigames like serve 200 litres of curry using a big digger arm, or save turtles drowning in a pool. There's some regular construction tasks thrown in for good measure, but it's all over the top nonsense and we love it. While it's easy to dismiss Power Shovel as a bit of madcap silliness, the destruction simulated is rather impressive for the PS1, particularly during the limo destruction level. It was also released in 2001 when the PS2 was already out, so would you rather play this or Disney's Dinosaur? Yeah, tough call. The real feather in Power Shovel's cap though is the special controller that Taito made to go alongside special edition releases in Japan. Shaped like the controls of an actual digger, the controller features 2 massive joysticks along with all the buttons needed to use the thing like a regular controller. Action beat-em-up fans were treated to what can only be described as an embarrassment of riches on the PS1. Fighting Force, Gekido and Taifu Wrath of the Tiger are just some of the examples that players enjoyed. But Bawana Fox and PS1 fan 1991 piped up in the comments to remind everyone about Ninja Shadow of Darkness. Playing as the ninja Kurosawa, Ninja Shadow of Darkness follows the acrobatic warrior as he travels across feudal Japan in an attempt to rid the world of an ancient and terrifying evil. I mean, the terrifying is kinda a given when it comes to evil, isn't it? There's no such thing as chill evil. Admittedly, Ninja Shadow of Darkness isn't the best reviewed game in the world, with many pointing to the weird control scheme as a reason why, but those who played this game as a child seem to have a lot of nostalgia for core design's departure from the success of Tomb Raider. The game was even developed on a brand new engine, which may explain any teething issues players might have had with Ninja's controls. Still, even with the negative reviews, Ninja Shadow of Darkness's beat-em-up gameplay is a lot of fun, and the huge amount of power-ups and new weapons ensures that the combat doesn't get old. Just good luck to anyone who is going to attempt to play this game, as Ninja Shadow of Darkness earns a reputation for being one of the hardest games of the PS1. At the very least, if you're feeling a bit overboard about playing this, if you catch our drift, you can always use save states to make the game somewhat easier. You're on your own for the rest of it though. Say what you want about the team that would ultimately become known as Studio Liverpool under the Sony banner, but Psygnosis refused to be known as the studio behind just one franchise, or the studio who would ever get home to their families apparently. The Mad Lads could have rested on the laurels of Lemmings and then Wipeout, and then maybe put Lemmings inside the Wipeout ships, but the team was throwing ideas at the wall to see what would stick for years. One that certainly deserved to stick was Life Force Tenka, with PS1 fan 1991 coming back again to point us in the right direction with his comment about the game's demo, noting that it looked really cool. PS1 fans' instincts are correct of course, as Life Force Tenka, or codename Tenka in some other regions, is a pretty underrated first-person shooter that casts players as the brilliantly named protagonist of Joseph D. Tenka. We reckon the D either stands for delicious or damn that's a massive gun, though that second one would probably be the most accurate given how Tenka boasts one of the most versatile weapons in gaming. Referred to as the self-generating polymorphic armory, or the SG-26, players unlock new modifications for the weapon and can switch between them as necessary, giving you versatility during every level and also the feeling of playing a Judge Dredd game on PS1 that isn't total cheeks. Between the new weapons, the terrifying enemies, and the 3D graphics that offer some of the best visuals on the console, Life Force Tenka is a pretty underrated PS1 banger and definitely deserves to be mentioned more. Even reviews at the time would broadly agree, as Tenka managed to earn mostly positive reviews across a wide variety of outlets. Is it an original shooter? Not really, but sometimes the most hidden gems are the ones that do the fundamentals just really well. Tenka definitely nails it in that regard, and it's high time that it had its flowers.
Oh yeah.
Unlike other hidden gems we've covered in the past, Time Commando is a relatively easy game to play in the modern age, as there's a port of this 1996 adventure available right now on Steam. Despite surviving the ravages of time, unlike plenty of other PS1 games from 1996, Time Commando is still considered a bit of a hidden gem, with our pal Andrew going to bat for the game in our comments. I wouldn't claim it's a good game, but it holds a special place in my heart. We appreciate the honesty there, Andrew, and you might be onto something. Perhaps the best place to search for hidden gems is with games that were given a pretty harsh reception? I'm Sean Connery, or simply weren't considered to be that good. Yes. Time Commando would definitely fit that mould, as it's a rather idiosyncratic game that demands a lot of patience from the player. The fixed camera angles and hit detection can often be rather frustrating, but stick with this and you'll find an experience well worth checking out. Unfortunately for those hoping that Time Commando is some kind of crossover between Jean-Claude Van Damme's Time Cop and Arnie's Commando, Time Commando sees players facing off against a machine running rampant thanks to a virus which has caused a huge time vortex that threatens the whole world. As the immaculately named Stanley, who looks like me when I read your mean comments about my pronunciation, you need to travel to various time periods from prehistoric Earth to the far-flung future, defeating enemies as you go. How does that stop the virus, you ask? Dunno, shooting an IKEA clock or something? Stop asking questions and enjoy a silly action-adventure game all hell night long. The PS1 is a treasure trove of horror titles, though it was hard for any horror games to break through the noise when the Resident Evil trilogy and the first Silent Hill were as successful as they were. Check out where they landed in our PS1 horror games video. Both franchises redefined horror on the PS1, while games like Hell Night fell by the wayside. Fortunately, one commenter by the name of Ashbates27, who isn't as tall as you might assume, brought us to the light. Hell Night by Atlas is a pretty cool hidden gem, and also I bet the guy who writes these scripts is extremely cool and handsome. While the second half of that comment is clearly the deranged ravings of a lunatic who actually thinks The Bouncer is a good video game, the first part is definitely true. A first-person survival horror game, Hell Night could be considered a bit of a precursor to the likes of Amnesia, Outlast and other pacifist horror games. In the subway tunnels of Tokyo, you're forced to hide from a mutant creature known as the Hybrid, who cannot be killed and will absolutely eviscerate you if it manages to catch you. As you make your way through the subway tunnels, you'll enter an area known as the Mesh, a self-sufficient society of people who became disenfranchised with a way of life above the surface, but are about to be disrupted by this vicious mutant. Fortunately for you, the Mesh plays host to a variety of characters who can join you in your exploration, giving you special abilities to help you survive against the monster. However, characters may have their own motivations and goals too, and there are multiple endings depending on who survives, making Hell Night one of the most unique horror games on the PS1. Talk about a hidden gem, eh? Maybe that Ash Bates guy was right after all. Definitely not about the Bouncer though. He was right about Urban Rain. He did have that.
And the H5050, this one's for you, buddy. Don't forget to send the 50 quid when you're ready. File Akuji the Heartless firmly under the heading Games That Would Be Never Made Today, and not without reason. The PS1 era is quite a strange period for games, exemplified by the utterly bizarre and mostly forgotten tale told by 1998's macabre fantasy title Akuji the Heartless. In fact, Akuji the Heartless wasn't so much slightly off the wall as it was strikingly weird and at times absurdly dark. Crystal Dynamics' late 90s action-adventure focused on the titular Akuji, a voodoo priest whose heart was literally torn out of his body on his wedding day, and who now must wander the underworld searching for a way back home. Weird or not, what the game did have going for it was its pedigree. Published by Eidos Interactive, the same people who put their name to most of the Thief games, and developed by Crystal Dynamics, the guys who birthed the excellent Gex the Gecko franchise, Akuji the Heartless was undeniably well made, even if its controversial setup and relentlessly dark tone proved off-putting for some. Bizarre, unsettling, and undeniably well put together. Akuji the Heartless is an underrated PS1 game that is definitely not for kids. The classic side-scroller has been one of the many casualties of the relentless march of technological advancement, with g-darius, who didn't win Pop Idol, serving as a great reminder that progress isn't without its downsides. Originally an arcade shoot-em-up and the fourth installment in the long line of Taito's long-running Darius entries, g-darius was ported to the PlayStation in 1998, eventually finding its way to other platforms such as the PC, PS2 and sometime later the PS4. In a similar vein to the games that preceded it, g-darius is a classic side-scrolling shoot-em-up in which players control the Silverhawk spaceship and must avoid obstacles and enemies as they progress through the various zones. Sadly, the Darius franchise never quite became a household name in the West. g-darius became lost and was missed by many as a string of other titles in the crowded market jostled for attention. But as side-scrollers go, Taito's excellent fast-paced adventure is a prime exponent of just how fun the venerable old genre used to be. Over the past few years, Capcom have made a pretty penny for themselves releasing collections of old Mega Man games. These include the mainline Mega Man Legacy Collection, the Mega Man X Legacy Collection, Mega Man 0/ZX Legacy Collection, and please allow me to get my breath here, Mega Man Battle Network Legacy Collection. There's still more Mega Man to compile though, with Mega Man Legends a prime candidate for re-release. Hopefully though, the collection will include The Misadventures of Tron Bonne, a prequel to the entire series. Following the anti-hero of the Legends series, The Misadventures of Tron Bonne sees the titular mech pilot and her loyal servbots trying to lie, cheat and steal in order to raise enough funds to rescue her family from crippling debt. With 3 different likes of levels available, which range from puzzle stages to adventure stages to action stages. Similar to the rest of the Legend series, The Misadventures of Tron Bonne deserves to be remembered alongside the best of the Mega Man series, and not just because of how deep it will put you into your overdraft just to buy a physical copy. Tron Bonne? No, money gone. Is there a title better that typifies the phrase underrated PS1 games like No One Can Stop Mr. Domino, produced by the little-known Japanese studio Arctic, which is simply a fantastic name? Mr. Domino charges players with placing down rows of dominoes along a variety of game stages in such a way that enough can be toppled effectively that the stage can be completed. Dominoes don't get much more hardcore than this, which is obvious really. While most contemporary AAA studios have budgets and tech to capture the same war zones, post-apocalyptic wastelands and endless tracts of open-world loveliness, studios in the PS1 days had to be far smarter and indeed stranger when it came to constructing their odd little worlds. Japanese games in particular evidence this commitment to the surreal and unconventional, and nowhere it is more apparent than a game that I will just call Noxmud from now on. A beautifully arranged, very quirky piece of design that takes a simple complex and makes it soar. Getting your dominoes in place is a challenging feat in its own regard, but Noxmud is made brilliant by the virtue of its irrepressible charm. If you like games like the gorgeous Katamari franchise, then you'll likely love this domino-obsessed cousin. When and where else could you enjoy puzzle games built around anthropomorphic dominoes in a mainline market? Keep your God of War Ragnarok. Give me No One Can Stop Mr. Domino, if you can stop him before he gets too powerful. Oh no, he's gone supernova and will end us all! Remember a simpler time in gaming when you could just load up an arcade shooter and have a blast, before throwing your controller halfway across the room because the game is coded to eat your continues like you're in Hungry Hippos? The PS1's shmup library is vast, and while franchises like R-Type, Gradius, Raiden and others have been given a chance to shine on additional platforms, games like Einhander have been almost forgotten entirely. A shame really, because Einhander is quite the banger. A sci-fi take on the Greek mythological story of Selene and Endymion, which is a great premise already. Einhander sees the moon colony of Selene at war with the earth colony of Sodom. As a pilot of the Einhander, this game actually gives you a good explanation as to why you're only one ship facing off against an entire fleet, as you are on kamikaze missions designed to do as much damage as possible before being blown to a pile of space dust. It's nice to know I was expected to die when I inevitably do, you know? It's like Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, a game that self-destructs after you die 2 times. Luckily I beat it with 0 deaths. Yep, definitely did. Even with the mighty score of 89 on Metacritic, Einhander is falling out of the minds of the many, and that's a pity. The world is a poorer place thanks to the untimely decline of the run-and-gun shooter. OK Studio MDHR did their best to bring the format back in the form of the animated adventure Cuphead, but for the most part you'll have to look back in time for the golden age of the medium. Developed by Mediavision and published by none other than Sony Computer Entertainment, Rapid Reload features 6 levels and gives the player a choice of protagonists that can cause carnage and destruction across them. There is a plot about 2 treasure hunters out to retrieve a legendary gemstone amidst all of the shooting, but frankly it would make no difference whether you are out to save a princess, topple a government or collect brightly coloured turnips. Rapid Reload is more about fast-paced action and breakneck gunplay than it is about a cohesive story. It's a great exponent of what run-and-gunners were all about back in the day, and Rapid Reload looks and sounds as good as it plays. When you really look at it, Gundam Battle Assault 2 had no other choice than to be underrated and overlooked. The first game, which was released on the PS1 in 1998, before being ported to the West after the turn of the millennium, didn't review the best, so naturally that would affect the sales of any sequel. What didn't help matters is that Gundam Battle Assault 2 is the fact that it launched exclusively on the PS1 at the tail end of 2002, with the console's successor, the PS2, already heading towards its 3rd year on shop shelves, and series like Grand Theft Auto are already starting to cook. What makes this all so tragic that Gundam Battle Assault 2 is considered to be a massive improvement over the original game, with tighter controls, more characters, better individual stories for each character, and improved visual presentation. While it might not stand amongst the classics of the fighting game genre, Gundam Battle Assault 2 is still a great fighting game that had an idea that perhaps should be revisited in the future. More 2D mech fights, please. Can we also revisit making some good Gundam games, please? It's been a while. Top-down shoot-em-ups were all the rage back during the PS1 generation of consoles, and even before then. The formula couldn't be simpler, as you often enter the room, laid waste to hundreds of enemies, usually with some kind of superior weapon, and then moved on to the next room. It's a genre that kept gaming alive for a while, and while Silent Bomber can count itself among those kinds of games, it's actually a bit different from others. Yes, you are cleaning out rooms, but instead you're using bombs like some kind of unhinged bomberman. You know, without those pesky walls or blocks obstructing your explosions. As former war criminal Juta, you've been drafted to infiltrate and destroy a space cruiser referred to as the Dante, and you'll achieve this by chucking bombs all over the place until the credits roll. What makes Silent Bomber so much fun is that the fact that players can chain bombs together and even acquire upgrades and power-ups that change the properties of bombs entirely, adding a bit of depth to what could have merely been a brainless series of explosions. Describing MDK doesn't really do it justice, at least in comparison to actually playing it. Players take on the role of the delightfully named Kurt Hectic, a leather-clad man of action and a part-time janitor who looks like a leather enthusiast role-playing as a xenomorph from Alien. Tasked with repelling an alien invasion, Kurt must destroy the large mine crawlers that have come to strip Earth of its natural resources. A plot that makes as little sense as the game's deranged visuals would indicate. Not that MDK would spend much of its time anywhere remotely resembling Earth. This bizarre game from Shiny Entertainment uses a migraine-inducing colour palette of blacks and oranges, giving the game a unique flavour, but occasionally threatening to induce the mother of all migraines. Strange or not, MDK is still held in high esteem today as one of the most influential shooters of the 90s. Its solid reviews at the time testifying to how bold and innovative Shiny Entertainment's underrated oddity actually was. Thanks to its relentless pace and glorious mission design, MDK was ahead of its time, and hey, you can basically put any non-Earthworm Jim game from Shiny on those lists. They really did know how to make some video gamey ass video games. There's something to be said about a game that goes for a strong opening, and one, the almost universally forgotten shoot-'em-up / platformer hybrid from 1997, is about as strong as it gets. Your character wakes up in an abandoned apartment with no memory of who they are, and then immediately has to leg it to avoid the helicopter firing missiles at you. Oh, and if that's not weird enough for you, you now have a barcode on the back of your neck, and one of your arms has been replaced with a machine gun. Perfect cinema. 10 out of 10. No notes. The actual core gameplay of 1 is spread out across 6 levels, with your amnesiac character having to run, jump, and of course gun your way through hordes of enemies in the pursuit of truth. Why are you the most wanted man in town? Who strapped a gun to your arm? What's with all these bottomless death pits you have to avoid? These are some of the questions that will be answered, while the game's dynamic camera angles and formula flipping boss fights ensure that the action never gets stale for long. Compared to a Final Fantasy VII or other PS1 masterpieces, 1 is admittedly a brainless daisy chain of explosions from the press start screen to the end credits. But there's beauty in that kind of simplicity. At the end of the day, 1 is a fun action game that definitely deserves to be remembered.
Lots of games during the PS1 era had force in the title, but few were as underrated or underappreciated as novel 90s fighting sim Psychic Force. Originally an arcade game, Psychic Force was ported to the PlayStation in 1997, a transfer that did little to diminish the charm of Taito's ambitious, if kind of flawed, take on one of the 90s' most popular genres. Instead of the standard underground fight clubs and pristine dojos that usually made pleasing backdrops to two burly men kicking one another in the head while shouting incomprehensible catchphrases, Psychic Force's action is framed by a cube-shaped magical force field. I hate when I enter cube-shaped magical force fields on the way to the shops. What set the game apart was that fights occurred not only from left to right but also up and down, as players floated up, down and across the screen, and proceedings tended to look like a brawl had broken out inside an indoor skydiving facility. It isn't the perfect game, hampered occasionally by a lack of proper depth and some pretty dreadful C-tier anime-ass dialogue.
Great power is a double-edged sword. You must not be allowed to use that power.
Don't stand in my way. I have an important job to do.
But what Psychic Force does have is charm and novelty. Its fun twist on the format, bringing something new to a genre that hasn't been seen much this side of something called Dragon Ball, or whatever that is. Hey kids, want some drugs? Okay, I don't have any drugs, but how about a weird PS1 game instead? The drugs are all for me. They say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, unless it's generated by AI, in which case it's worthless. So, following that logic, LSD Dream Emulator is like stitching together War and Peace, Moby Dick, the Iliad, and that one overly verbose speech from the old guy in the second Matrix film. It's a lot to take in visually, is what we're trying to say. It is supposed to be a dream emulator though, and we've all had those dreams where you wake up thinking, what the hell was that? I don't need to do my maths GCSE, I'm 32 years old. So imagine an entire disc of levels like that, and you're about there. Usually I would rather die than do my maths GCSE again. You can't make me. I'll die. I will do something drastic. There's no real goal or objective to complete here. You're literally exploring bite-sized dreams that are about 10 minutes in length, in which you can stumble upon anything from dancing rabbits to a live sumo match. Originally, this bonkers and highly innovative title was only available in Japan, but in the past few years, dedicated modders and fans have released an English translated version which is available via emulation. Shh, we didn't say anything. We're not necessarily promoting emulation here guys, but the clue is quite literally in the game's name. This game is simply too weird and unique not to play through or experience at least once in your life. We're also not necessarily promoting LSD either, as standing up too fast is all the rush we personally need now that we're past the age of 30. Hey, remember that guy from The Matrix? Then do you recall the PS2 Matrix games? Well, the dudes who made them were a bit of an underrated banger factory. Shiny Entertainment may have built a reputation and ultimately a legacy on profound weirdness and kinda also underrated Matrix games, but they were never a developer to let quirkiness get in the way of quality. Who could forget the Smith Kaiju? Designed by David Perry, the same man who worked on the original Earthworm Jim in 1994, Wild 9 was a sort of 2.5D platform adventure that took many of Shiny Entertainment's offbeat sensibilities and transposed them into an adventure platformer that was as boldly individual as it was punishingly difficult. Following the brilliantly named Wex Major, I love that so much, as he navigates his way through as he navigates his way through a strange new galaxy, making eccentric friends and forming the game's titular group. Wild 9 was never quite as polished or cohesive as Earthworm Jim or its many sequels, but it's well worth digging out for anyone who can't get enough of the sort of quirky humour that made Jim a household name. Also, being able to use telekinetic powers to whip people onto spikes and use their corpses as bridges is absolutely wild for the PS1. Cartoonish, fun, and with an identity all of its own, Wild 9 is easily one of the most underrated PS1 games ever made. Here's a slightly weird confession though. This game scared the hell out of me when I was young, and I don't know why. And so did this next game, which is no Crash Bandicoot. You don't need us to tell you that the PlayStation was a trailblazer in a lot of ways. Sony's first stab at the console market, the first PlayStation pioneered discs, significantly more so than the Saturn, in a medium still focused on using cartridges. While the DualShock controller has become the blueprint that many console and controller manufacturers have tried to replicate in the years since. One neat feature that's a bit more obscure is how various games use the CD playing function in-game, with the most famous probably being Monster Rancher. You put in a CD, you'd get a weird monster. What's not to love? However, we're putting the focus today on vib-ribbon, a rhythm action game that actually allowed players to use their own music via CDs, long before you could just make your own custom chart on Clone Hero. After inserting the game's disc, you were given the option to enter your own CD. At which point vib-ribbon would create rhythm action levels and obstacles based on the music being played. The game doesn't look and sound like pretty much anything else on the PlayStation. In a way, it's also one of the first interactive music visualizers, which is pretty dang neat. It's a pretty expensive equalizer these days though, as the game never actually came to the United States. Checkmate, Eagle people. Anyone else remember spinning hybrid theory on this bad boy back in the day? It's crazy that culture still continues after this absolute peak. Hey, do you like beat 'em ups? How about beat 'em ups with gun? Late 90s beat 'em up Fighting Force debuted at an odd time for the genre as a whole, especially considering core design had kinda made a template for success with Tomb Raider the year prior. Beat-em-up games had enjoyed their initial peak in the 80s with franchises such as Streets of Rage and Final Fight cornering this enjoyably hard-edged corner of the market. The genre would see a resurgence later on thanks to the likes of Beautiful Joe and God Hand in the 2000s, not to mention the rise of the hack and slash genre as a whole, but in 1999 things weren't looking so rosy thanks to difficulties with the 3D transition. Perhaps that's why Fighting Force and its maligned sequel ended up falling between the cracks at a time when the industry was enjoying something of a massive overhaul. Situated slap bang in the middle of a wave that was enduring a trough rather than happily enjoying a peaking crest, Fighting Force's tale of a brave crew of fighters taking down criminal mastermind by punching everything in sight failed to generate much critical or commercial attention. That all being said, the first Fighting Force game is something of a lost cult classic, a satisfying brawler that gives you everything you could want from a beat-em-up game released back in the 90s. It was never exactly revolutionary in terms of its characters, plot, or setup, or, well, pretty much anything, but for being one of the first brawlers to really translate the action from 2D to 3D, Fighting Force deserves more attention than it ever actually received. Sure, it plays about as gracefully as an influencer apology video, but goddammit, if straight up shooting people trying to punch you isn't the most fun of all time. Hey, think you've played every 3D fighter on the PS1? Think again.
Ready, fight!
The original PlayStation boasts probably the best library of fighting games in gaming history, not including current platforms anyway. So many classics made their way onto Sony's big grey beautiful box, including Tekken 2 and 3, Marvel vs Capcom, Street Fighter Alpha 3, and that barely covers all of the absolute bangers that you can still play and enjoy on the system to this day. While some of the more underrated games include Battle Arena Toshinden and Ergites, God Bless the Ring, which I absolutely hate saying all of the time, Tobal number 1 definitely deserved more attention too. A 3D fighter with characters designed by the late great Akira Toriyama, Tobal number 1 allowed for full freedom of movement during a battle, with a wide range of attacks and even a grappling system for fans of suplexing people all over the shop. There was even a quest mode which expanded the regular gameplay into a 3D dungeon crawler, with players unlocking new characters by defeating them in the mode. Of course, there was no save file for this mode for some curious reason, so you either got good at the opening fights quickly, or quit altogether. While it might sound like a forgotten aftershave promoted by Topher Grace at the height of his fame, Tobal number 1's character design by the iconic Akira Toriyama and Virtua Fighter-esque look means it's absolutely worth trying out. Rest in peace, you absolute friggin' legend. Nobody will ever forget what you did with Dragon Ball. Now let's talk about fairies before I start to cry.
Get ready, fight!
Let me just start this section off by simply saying, off the rip, bring back Bloody Roar. The market has always been one brimming with competition. The fighting game niche has for a long while been mainly sewn up by a couple of major properties, most of which debuted when you still had to go to an arcade and part with your hard-earned quarters if you wanted a safe place to roundhouse your best mate using a character with the head of a leopard. Fighting games never change. Tekken, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat. These are the names that have become household, around forever and certainly not going anywhere anytime soon. It's little wonder then that with such heavyweights dominating the arena that there wasn't much room left in the ring for a new contender looking to become a champion. Punching! What Bloody Roar did have on its side was the novelty factor, building itself around the concept of having a group of fighters capable of transforming into a variety of animals in combat. Kinda like Animorphs, but not completely cursed. Coupled with polished, pretty punchy gameplay and enticing design, Bloody Roar managed to just about hold its own, going on to spawn 3 sequels, including another one on the PlayStation 1 up until 2003. That's more than 20 years ago. Sadly, however, it could never quite muscle in on the big boys' racket, now only remembered as one of the most underrated PS1 fighting games you've likely never played. If they released Bloody Roar today, there would absolutely be a market for it. I mean, a very specific market, but a pretty dedicated market all the same. Are you in the market for an underrated banger of a turn-based RPG? It must have been ridiculous to have been an RPG development team working on a PS1 release, as it's a console library that boasts a real killer row of RPG Hall of Fame picks. Final Fantasy VII, 8, 9, Vagrant Story, Suikoden 2, Wild Arms, Parasite Eve. Those games alone are barely scratching the surface of the excellent RPGs on the platform, so it's no wonder that games like Legend of Legaia managed to fall through the cracks. That's a shame, as Legaia's approach to combat makes it one of the most unique games on Sony's first platform, as well as a good reminder of the kind of mad swings they used to take as a publisher before they re-released The Last of Us like 3 times. Set in a world where magical beasts called Sera have been corrupted by a mysterious mist, Legend of Legaia thrusts you into the shoes of Varn, not that one, a hero who's able to summon a special kind of Seru and cleanse the mist. What makes Legend of Laika so interesting is its approach to turn-based combat, as instead of picking an action from a menu, you input a series of attack commands to create special sequences called arts, or in Helldivers 2, we call them stratagems. Players can chain these commands together to devastate opponents, creating an experience that's still incredibly unique, and one we're surprised hasn't been copied much since. Legend of Laika saw a sequel on PS2, Laika 2 Dual Saga, which even few people seem to have played, but we might just feature that on an underrated PS2 games list. Do you want to see that? Let us know down below. You know what we're definitely not getting another game from? This next weird ass survival horror series. Galarians isn't perhaps the most enticing, intriguing or enigmatic title for a game, but you can't help but feel it might have sounded better in its original Japanese form, which I am not going to even attempt to say to maintain diplomatic relations with an entire country. Joe, put it on the screen please mate, thank you. Polygon Magic Survival Horror tells the story of Rico, a boy with psychic powers who awakens to discover that he's the only one capable of halting the advance of the game's eponymous genetically advanced humanoids. Thanks to its clear creative debt to the original Resident Evil games, Galarians does end up suffering from many of the same issues that threaten to undermine the excellence of Capcom's iconic franchise, but without much of that weird, unknowable charm that somehow makes it an absolutely essential piece of video game art. That's right, I'm talking about sandwiches. But in Galarians, some rather wonky cutscenes, cliched storytelling, and visual and sound design that could never quite match the tone the game was trying to set really stick out a good bit more. Still, for a game that came out in 1999, Galarians does a pretty good job of telling its oddball story and selling its futuristic nightmare, doing enough to earn pretty solid reviews and even spawn a sequel in the shape of Galarians Ash for the PS2. That box art, by the way, that's very, very cold. With us currently in the midst of a second golden age of survival horror, who's to say that we couldn't see another Galarians game? Literally everyone. Yeah, fair enough. But do you like animals? Okay, we already established that with the bloody raw entry when you literally started howling. But do you like Skies of Arcadia too? This last game is just for you. A dark horse contender for the PS1 game most eligible for a remake or remaster, Tail Concerto for the PS1 was CyberConnect 2's first attempt at marrying cute animals with mechs in a series referred to as Little Tail Bronx. While it's an idea that the Japanese devs would revisit over the years, as well as the same Naruto game about 19 bloody times, it would take their fourth entry, Fuga Melodies of Steel, for the LTB series to really gain more mainstream attention. Now that Fuga is barreling towards a third game in that subseries, maybe now is the time for Tail Concerto to have another go. Years and years before Paw Patrol, and even more years before Captain Turbot committed grand larceny, Tail Concerto lets you play as a canine cop with the remarkably adorable name of Waffle Rye Bread, who comes into conflict with a group of sky pirates known as the Black Cats Gang. Unlike the RPGs in the Little Tail Bronx series, Tail Concerto is more of a platformer, with players travelling through levels trying to rescue kittens and trying to stop the Black Cats Gang from stealing ancient crystals. Low sales in Japan might have stopped Tail Concerto from gaining more notoriety, but it's never too late for a second chance, just like Judy did to Jason Bateman in Zootopia. Am I a friend of the furries yet? If you've been loving the 90s platformer renaissance of the last few years, Tail Concerto is a game worth oh, never mind. Never mind that. The solution is just a Google search away, my guys.